child. Then when she wakes up, somehow she still believes him. All I knew you before. That's it.
She didn't correct them. She didn't clarify. She didn't step in when the story started drifting further and further from the truth. She just watched it happen. And for a long time, no one could understand why. If you care about the real stories behind the legends, the moments they never explain, subscribe to RetroWaves. There was a moment when the silence became louder than the music. It wasn't during a performance. It wasn't during an interview. It wasn't even during a scandal. It happened quietly, when people began noticing what she wasn't saying. Stevie Nicks had always been someone who spoke in symbols, in metaphors, in half-lit images that hovered somewhere between confession and myth. But this was different. This time, she said nothing at all. And the absence of her voice created a vacuum the world was eager to fill. At first, the speculation felt harmless. Fans noticed changes in her lyrics, in her interviews, in the way she talked around certain topics without ever landing on them. Questions started forming, softly at first. Why did she avoid that name? Why did she stop telling that story the way she used to? Why did certain songs suddenly feel heavier, or quieter, or unfinished? She was still present, still performing, still luminous. But something important was being stepped around, and people could feel it. Stevie had built a career on emotional openness, but never on full exposure. She gave just enough truth to feel intimate while keeping the center protected. That balance had always been deliberate, but now the balance felt off, because the silence wasn't poetic, it was deliberate, and deliberate silence always invites interpretation. Some believed she was protecting someone else. Others believed she was protecting herself. There were those who thought she was rewriting history without ever saying so, and others who believed the truth was simply too painful to speak aloud. What made it worse was that she could have stopped it. One interview, one sentence, one quiet clarification. She never did. Over time, the rumors became more confident, not louder, but sharper. They were repeated as if they were facts, passed down through fan forums, documentaries, articles, whispered conversations after shows. Each retelling smoothed the edges, removed the uncertainty, until eventually the speculation sounded like truth. And still, she said nothing. People began pointing to moments. A pause during a song, a lyric delivered differently, a look she held just a second too long before turning away from the crowd. They treated these moments like evidence, as if grief always announces itself clearly, as if silence can only mean guilt or regret or shame. But that wasn't the part that stayed with her. What stayed with her was something much quieter, something no one was asking about. Stevie had lived most of her life in public, her loves, her losses, her mistakes, all dissected in real time. She knew what happened when words escaped. She knew how easily truth could be flattened once it left her mouth, and she also knew something else, that once a story is spoken, it no longer belongs to you. It belongs to the listener. And listeners reshape things, even when they don't mean to. So she chose restraint, not because she had nothing to say, but because she had too much, and saying the wrong thing, or saying the right thing at the wrong time, would freeze the story into something incomplete. Still, people wanted answers. They always do, especially when the silence feels personal. The longer she avoided it, the more the silence itself became the story. Interviewers tiptoed, questions were asked sideways, comments were made carefully, as if circling a fragile object that no one wanted to touch directly. And Stevie responded the same way every time. She smiled, she shifted, she spoke about something else, as if the question had never landed. Some fans admired the control, others felt frustrated by it. A few felt betrayed. They had grown up with her voice narrating their own emotional lives. They believed they were owed the truth. But that assumption was never one she shared. What most people didn't realize was that the silence wasn't about hiding something ugly. It was about refusing to simplify something complicated, because the truth she carried didn't fit neatly into a headline. It couldn't be explained in a soundbite, and it couldn't survive being stripped of its context. Years later, she would admit that even she wasn't sure how to talk about it at the time. Not without losing something important in the process, but she didn't say that yet. Not then. Instead, she let the world speculate. She let the story bend. She let the assumptions live. And she carried the weight of being misunderstood, quietly, on purpose, because there was a part of this story that wasn't meant to be solved quickly, and revealing it too early would have changed everything for her and for the people she was trying to protect. The silence didn't make the questions go away. It sharpened them. As years passed, the story people thought they knew became more solid, more rehearsed. It was repeated in documentaries, summarized in articles, woven into the larger mythology surrounding her life. And because Stevie never corrected it, the version that survived wasn't necessarily the truest one. It was simply the most convenient. There were moments when it almost broke through. A question asked too directly, a memory drifting too close to the center, a pause that lingered longer than intended. In those moments, her voice would soften, not crack, not falter, just soften, as if she were stepping carefully around something fragile, something that still hurt to touch. People often mistake silence for distance, but this silence was intimate. It lived close to her. It followed her into recording studios, into rehearsal rooms, into hotel rooms, where the noise of the world finally fell away. And even there, alone, it remained, because the story she wasn't telling wasn't finished yet. Not emotionally, not even for her. Those closest to her understood this. They noticed how certain topics were gently redirected, how certain memories were acknowledged only in fragments. A sentence would begin, then dissolve into something safer. A name would hover, then disappear. It wasn't denial, it was containment. What complicated everything was how deeply this unspoken truth was connected to her art. Listeners heard it without realizing they were hearing it. They felt it in the weight of certain lines, in the way some songs seemed to carry a shadow behind them. But because the story wasn't openly named, people filled in the blanks with their own experiences, their own heartbreaks, their own regrets, and in doing so, they missed what was actually there. Stevie had always believed that songs could hold truths that words could not. That melody could carry grief without explaining it. That silence inside a lyric could be more honest than a paragraph of explanation. But even she didn't anticipate how much meaning would be projected onto the absence of her voice outside the music, especially when the speculation began to drift toward judgment. There were times when she was painted as cold, as evasive, as someone who refused to take responsibility for her past. And those versions hurt, not because they were cruel, but because they were incomplete. They reduced something deeply human into something easily digestible, and she had spent her entire career resisting that kind of flattening. What people didn't see was the restraint it took to remain quiet, to sit in interviews knowing that a single sentence could rewrite years of misunderstanding and still choosing not to speak, to watch a narrative solidify around you, knowing it wasn't entirely right and accepting the cost of letting it stand. That kind of silence isn't passive, it's heavy, and it demands something from you every day. There were nights when she considered breaking it, when the urge to finally explain rose unexpectedly, not out of anger, out of exhaustion. But each time she returned to the same conclusion: the truth wasn't hers alone to give, and once spoken, it would no longer be gentle, it would be analyzed, questioned, pulled apart, and whatever meaning it held for her would be lost in the process. So, she waited, not for the world to be ready, but for herself to be. Time has a way of changing how memories feel. What once felt sharp becomes softer. What once felt unbearable becomes survivable. And slowly, almost without noticing, she began to see the story differently, not as something that needed to be defended, but as something that could finally be acknowledged, if the moment was right. Still, that moment hadn't arrived yet, and she knew it, because even now, the silence still served a purpose. There was one particular misunderstanding that bothered her more than the rest, not because it was false, but because it was close enough to the truth to be dangerous. It captured the shape of what happened, without the substance, and in doing so, it changed the emotional meaning entirely. That was the version people clung to, and correcting it would require opening doors she had kept closed for a very long time. So she let it exist. She let people believe what they needed to believe, and she carried the fuller story alone, not as a burden, but as a responsibility. By the time she finally spoke about it, even partially, most people didn't realize how long she had been holding her breath. They didn't realize how carefully she had protected the edges of the truth, or how close she had come more than once to saying too much too soon. What she eventually shared wasn't an explanation, it was an offering, and even then it was incomplete, because some things, once lived, can never be fully translated. But that moment, the one when the silence finally shifted, didn't come suddenly. It arrived quietly, after years of restraint, after the speculation had hardened, after the misunderstandings had settled into place. And when it came, it changed the story in a way no rumor ever could, not by correcting the world, but by revealing something she had never allowed herself to say out loud before. When she finally spoke about it, there was no announcement, no build-up, no attempt to reclaim the narrative. It happened the way most honest moments do, unexpectedly, in the middle of something else. A question was asked, gently, not the one people had rehearsed for years, not the one wrapped in accusation or expectation, just a simple invitation to reflect. And this time, she didn't step around it. She didn't name it the way the world had. She didn't confirm or deny the rumors. She didn't correct the timelines. Instead, she talked about distance, about how some experiences live inside you in a way that can't be reduced to labels or explanations, about how love doesn't always end cleanly, and how loss doesn't always look like loss from the outside. What she revealed, without ever stating it directly, was that the silence had never been about hiding the truth. It was about protecting its meaning, because the version the world wanted was simple. Someone was right, someone was wrong, someone left, someone stayed. But that wasn't what happened. What happened was slower, more human, more unresolved. She spoke about carrying something for years without knowing what to call it. about how time doesn't always give you answers. Sometimes it just teaches you how to live with the questions. And in that moment, it became clear why she had stayed silent for so long. The truth wasn't dramatic. It wasn't scandalous. It was fragile. And once spoken, it would lose the one thing she had protected above all else, its honesty. The rumors had assumed conflict, but what she described was grief without an ending, a connection that didn't break, but quietly changed shape, something that never fully left her life, even after the world moved on. That kind of truth doesn't fit inside speculation, and it doesn't survive being argued over. She admitted calmly that she had once thought she owed people an explanation, that she had wrestled with that idea for years, but eventually she understood something that took her a lifetime to learn. Some stories are finished for the world long before they are finished for the people who lived them, and speaking too soon would have forced an ending that wasn't real. The silence, it turned out, had been an act of care, not avoidance, not denial. Care for herself, for the other person involved, for the music that carried traces of that story long after the words stopped. She hadn't stayed quiet because she was afraid. She stayed quiet because she knew exactly what would be lost if she spoke before she was ready. When people asked why she waited so long, she didn't offer a justification. She simply said that understanding arrives when it arrives, and that forcing clarity too early can turn truth into something performative, something hollow. She refused to let that happen, even if it meant being misunderstood for years. Looking back, the silence feels different once you understand it. It no longer feels like an absence. It feels like a boundary, a quiet line she drew around something that mattered too much to hand over to interpretation. And once that boundary softened, once she was ready to acknowledge it without trying to explain it, the story finally settled. Not into an answer, but into acceptance. She didn't rewrite the past. She didn't correct the record. She didn't take anything back. She simply allowed herself to say what had always been true, that not everything meaningful needs to be clarified, and not every silence is a secret. Some are simply the sound of someone choosing to hold something gently for as long as they need to. And when the world finally stopped speculating, what remained wasn't a revelation. It was something quieter, a sense that the silence had done exactly what it was meant to do. It kept the truth intact, until it could be lived with and let go. Long after the interviews faded, the songs remained. They always do. People returned to them with different ears once they understood what the silence had been protecting. Lines that once felt mysterious now felt careful. Pauses that once seemed dramatic now felt deliberate, not as clues, but as boundaries. What changed wasn't the music. It was the way people listened. They stopped trying to extract answers from it. They stopped searching for confession. And in that quiet shift, something softened. The songs no longer felt like puzzles to be solved. They felt like places to sit. Stevie never framed this as closure. She never said the story was finished, because it wasn't. It simply no longer needed defending. Time had done what explanations couldn't. It had dulled the urge to interrogate and strengthened the ability to accept what can't be fully known. There's a misconception that silence only exists before truth, that once something is said, the silence disappears. But in her case, silence followed the truth too, not because there was more to hide, but because some understanding doesn't need reinforcement. Once it's felt, repeating it only weakens it. She continued performing, continued speaking about art, about memory, about the strange way love leaves fingerprints long after it's gone. But she never returned to the center of that story, not directly, and she never needed to, because the point was never to explain what happened. It was to survive it without turning it into something smaller than it was. If there's anything the years revealed, it's this: not all silence is absence. Some silence is preservation. A way of letting something remain complex in a world that prefers conclusions. A way of honoring a truth without turning it into a headline. For a long time, people thought the mystery was the story. But it wasn't. The story was the restraint, the patience, the choice to let meaning arrive slowly, or not at all, and the courage it takes to live with that. By the end, there was nothing left to prove, nothing left to clarify, just a quiet understanding that some lives are shaped as much by what's held back as by what's shared, and that sometimes the most honest thing an artist can do is stay silent, not forever, just long enough.